So we'll have that there. Howdy, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Jed Appleruth here with a excellent guest, Seth Perler, who's joining us today from Colorado. And we're going to have a great talk today. We have an hour, and we'll be talking about how to help optimize learning for kids in the world right now. A few words about Seth. I've been very impressed with his work for a long time. He is an expert in the field of studying and learning and EF coaching. He's really quite masterful. He's contributed a lot to the space. He's hosted big workshops. He's a prolific video blogger and writer. And Seth, we are very, very grateful and happy to have you here today.
I'm grateful to be here. I'm super excited to talk about kids and the brain and all those things.
I like it. All right, so we have some questions we have preloaded, and then we're going to save plenty of time at the end for Q&A, because I know I guarantee there'll be questions from the audience. So we're going to tee things off, talking about learning right now. It's definitely been a challenge. I've been getting calls from our clients, of course, but even my friends. I have friends calling me, and they're worried about their kids. They're worried about learning loss. I have kids asking me about the private schools in Atlanta. They're pondering changing off from the public to the private. Is it worth it? Can we get in? What do you know about school? And it's oftentimes two kids, one kid's doing fine, one kid's really struggling in the same household, and they're trying to figure out how do we help the one who's really falling behind. And so why don't we open up and talk about, there was one question before we jump into all the details. Is there one single thing that you want to say is the most important for parents and educators right now when it comes to helping kids thrive in the current moment?
Yeah, well, whether it's in this current moment or not, the thing that I always say and that I always start all of my talks off with, and I always end all of my talks with, is the same thing. And what I always say is that the most important thing is the relationship. So there's something called attachment theory, and there's something called healthy and securely attached relationships. And security in a relationship means that it's when you are relating with someone, whether it's a spouse, a friend, a coworker, a teacher, and a student, whatever the relationship, a secure relationship feels secure. You feel heard, seen, known, understood. You feel like that person's got your back. And when we have an insecure relationship called either anxious or avoidant, that it doesn't feel as safe. It can feel like you're not being seen or heard or understood. And I'm not going to go too far into that, but the gist is that I think that the most important thing, and it's very hard definitely with teachers online right now, but it's still possible to build the relationship, build the relationship, build the relationship. But with the family too, this is a great time. And it's a very difficult time when everybody's stuck at home and everybody's in each other's space so much. But nonetheless, it's an opportunity to see how can we problem solve? How can we teach our child to work within the relationship, to be solution oriented, to learn how to hear each other and see each other and understand each other and build that sort of thing. Now online, again, it's much harder, but it can be done. And I think one big thing that I'll point out right now that feels very insecure to a lot of the kids that I work with. So I'm an executive function coach. The students I work with struggle with executive function, with getting things done. They're already struggling with stuff like they do every semester, but now this semester, their zeros are piling up. They're getting into a situation where they're failing so quickly now. Rather, usually it's not this severe, but it's so hard for them to engage, to jump through the hoops and all these things. So then when they have teachers who, for example, give them 0 credit for late work or 50% credit for late work or things like that, it doesn't feel secure to them because they start saying, why should I even try? So the way that, if you listen to my vlog from last week, I really ranted on grades and my problem with grades in general and how outdated they are and what have you. But regardless, when the students are struggling, it's how do we create a relationship where they feel safe, whether it has to do with grades, learning the homework, having options, any number of things, but it's about feeling safe and secure first, foremost, above everything else. These kids feel like they have a safe and secure base in their families and with their teachers, then no matter what craziness happens. I just saw one of my parents outside my house a few minutes ago, one of the parents of one of my kids, and she said, yeah, we're just thinking of this year as the lost year.
Last year.
You know, she's getting all A's, but she's not learning anything, and the bar is so low. But, you know, everybody's having different experiences. But either way, what we want is to be taking this time, build the relationship. Your kids will be okay. But really focus on that. Security is everything. It's going to last them their whole life, the skills that they learn with that. So that's my not so quick answer to your question.
Yeah, I like that. And I like touching on the, security of the attachment and connections. And I think part of the insecure attachment piece is, there's an anxiety piece, an anxious attachment, the whole sense of things are not going to be okay. And there's fear. And I know when my friends are calling me, and it's based on fear. There's a sense of things are going off the rails, things are not going well for one of my children or others. And is there anything you tell like your parents, trying to talk about helping them manage the feelings of the moment, the anxiety, the sense of loss of control, and just trying to rein this thing in, but it seems like so much is out of our control. Any counsel or guidance you give for those anxious parents out there?
Yeah, and meanwhile, to all the viewers out there today, do you hear crazy noise, or is it coming through on the mic?
Don't hear it.
So it's blocking it out, but they're chainsawing or something. So let me know, and I'll close the window if it does come through. So yeah, well, how some of the things that I talk to parents about and teachers about in terms of the anxiety, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, in terms of the anxiety is there, how do you, when you have a parent or an educator who's really jacked up on the anxiety and there's fear, anything you tell them or coach them through in this time?
Yeah, I mean, part of what I talk about is mirroring or co-regulation or attunement.
Yeah.
Those are all, to Seth's brain, very similar concepts. And what happens is that, for example, Jed and I right now, we don't know each other very well, but we're communicating verbally, but our nervous systems are also speaking to each other. Also, as I'm speaking to you, the audience, I'm aware that you're there and I'm communicating with a regulated nervous system, but you're reading my nervous system. So what I feel or sense, you're bouncing off of. Our kids, our nervous systems are always speaking to each other 24/7. So when we're with our kids or our spouse or our friends or in a store and speaking to somebody who works there or anywhere, we are always co-regulating. We're always communicating nervous system to nervous system. So as a parent or a teacher, what we want to do is work on our own nervous systems, our own stories and narratives in our mind and our own bodies or somatic bodies or nervous systems, and working on what's called emotional regulation. Now, I could get into hours talking about emotional regulation, but essentially as we get older, we learn tools to regulate emotion. For those of us who don't learn tools or very good, effective tools for emotional regulation as adults, we struggle. We seek out therapists or counselors or psychiatrists or psychologists or treatment centers or any number of ways to learn how to, or books or journaling or meditation classes or whatever. We seek out ways as adults to learn to work with it so that we can resolve these things, unless we don't, because not everybody does that. But the more we do that and we work on ourselves, we do our own deep inner work and learn to regulate more and work with our own anxieties and our own fears and those sorts of things, that we don't even have to tell our kids we're doing it. Our nervous system does the talking. They notice that we are more stabilized, more grounded, more regulated. And if they're dysregulated and they come to us, their nervous system knows that they have a more regulated nervous system to come to. If their nervous system comes to us and we're dysregulated and they're dysregulated, we can move past the issue, but we don't necessarily resolve the issue or go through it in a way that's really something that's planting a seed for our kids' future, for them to be building tools. So sometimes we avoid it, we yell about it, and it's just over, but it's not really over. So there's a difference between getting over it and getting through it. I talk about getting over it. When somebody says just get over it, that's not getting through it. We want to teach our kids, how do we get through it? So us doing our own work, our own reflection, introspection, self-awareness, mindfulness. So much of it, I just did my summit, the Executive Function Summit, and so many of the speakers talk about that as we do our own work, like we think it's so much about our child, but so much of it is really the more we're doing on us, the more we're co-regulating that to them. They're feeling it in our nervous system, and we're always attuning and vibing off of each other. So does that help answer how I approach some of that stuff with parents?
That helps a lot. And that sense of when you're bringing calm and centered and regulated, that that will shift the person with whom you're speaking instantly. And yeah,
And when you're not, that's actually okay too. But what's important when you're not, to me at least, is that when we're not in that space is to call out the elephant in the room and say, I feel really, and then the more we can be articulating what's going on in the body, in our nervous system, and get away from the story, the more I can say, wow, I'm feeling really angry in my body. I'm noticing my shoulders are like this and my voice is raised at you. I don't like what's going on, you know. I hope we can resolve this. Saying things like that, even if you're not regulated, can bring it to light, but you're mirroring
yeah,
with your language to the child, hey, I can articulate what's going on with me. Listen to what I'm saying. You can also practice articulating what's going on with you in more non-judgmental ways. And you know, as opposed to what we normally do, which, Jed, is, you know, a lot of us, we're very, things are very automatic, very habituated. We are very patterned, and we just learn the patterns when we're kids, and we just keep doing them unconsciously. So what we want to do is become conscious of these things, because when we become conscious of them, then we can make different decisions rather than being ruled by our narrative and our story and our nervous system and our body. We can now, I'm going to reiterate that. Instead of being ruled by our narrative and our story and our nervous system and our body and it telling us what to do, we can pause and say, wait, how do I want to respond? Instead of just being reactive, how do I want to respond in this situation? And that takes us into very different conversations, very different nervous systems, very different opportunities for solution.
fabulous. All right, that's excellent. Let me ask you some questions. I'm going to pivot a little bit towards structure and notions of structure in a time where there's been some real disruptions. And right now, I think a lot of people, parents, families, were experiencing a lack of structure, or often there are just changes in structure. That, you know, maybe a year ago, things were more steady, stable, organized. It was more reliable. So why is that wreaking havoc for some families? Why does structure matter?
Well, earlier, I forget exactly how you put it, but earlier now that thought it'll pop up in a minute. But essentially, I'm going to go back to the attachment stuff.
Yep.
In the attachment stuff, we feel secure, safe. The nervous system feels safe. When we are dysregulated, we feel unsafe. We feel threatened. Whether or not there's a real threat, like a bear coming close to you, or if you saw that cougar video that was going around the internet where the cougar was chasing the guy
It's
for 6 minutes,
intense. Yeah.
his so that's a real threat. His nervous system should be completely activated at that time. But what happens is we can get really, as you said, into anxiety, into these looping stories and narratives in our head that can cause a lot of this. But when it comes to structure, structure is safe. Now, not all structures are the right structures or are right for everybody, but so we're speaking very broad here, right? But structure feels safe. It's predictable. It's not abstract. A lot of anxiety that adults and kids experience is because of abstraction. We don't know what's coming. We don't know if it's safe or not. And that abstraction is difficult to deal with the nervous system. We want resolution and structure. It feels safe. So with the security, the attachment stuff, it feels like a safe place. That's what structure, good structure, can provide.
And so right now, with things shifting and changing, how do we create structure with the uncertainty of the moment and things? Am I going to be in school, not in school? You know, how do we help our kids manage that and create some form of safety and structure for them with things shifting?
Yeah, well, it's different for parents and for teachers. So when it comes to parents, I mean, you still want the same thing. You want buy-in and ownership, but it is way, 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 way harder for parents to get buy-in and ownership when you're externally imposing a structure on your child. So if you're saying this is what time we're doing school, this is what time you're doing lunch, this is what time you're doing recess, this is what time you're doing homework, that external structure, for my kids who struggle with executive function, they don't want to hear it from their parents. They want to feel like they've got buy-in, they've got ownership, they're part of the process. It's a democratic process, it's collaborative, it's not authoritative. And many of us have grown up in households or communities or subcultures that are very authoritative, and we've learned that, so we think we're doing the right thing. But when we look at, is this black or white question, is this working for my child or not, we can answer yes. For some kids it might work, but for the students I work with, for 99% of them, that sort of a structure they are just repulsed by. It corrodes the relationship, and it's not working. So in order to impose that sort of a structure from parents, we want to really, and I don't have time in this, because this is one of the biggest questions I get. You probably hear this a lot too, but it's, how do you get buy-in? How do you get buy-in from your child? Well, we could write books on that, but what we need to get buy-in and ownership. They need to be a part of the process. They need to feel heard. We want to try, sometimes when I'm working with students, I know where I want to take them, but I want them to feel like it's their idea.
Yeah.
So the more I can do that, the more buy-in and ownership I get, and the more they're going to be able to adapt to that structure. The other thing, and teachers similarly, but teachers can be much more, it's a lot easier to get that. Now, teachers, I will tell you that a lot of times when you tell parents, here's the structure, a lot of parents, particular parents who have good executive function and like to follow the rules, they love it because you're giving them something black and white. So the abstraction for the parents can be hard too, but also that can help the parents because the parents can say, look, the teacher said this is what needs to happen. And that can help them not have to get so much buy-in. So there are some ways. And then another thing I want to mention to families and teachers is the more visual, the better. So whatever structures you're imposing, if you're putting up a weekly general basic schedule of the week, a monthly, a daily, whatever, I'm talking about structuring time now, but it doesn't have to be time, but it could also be their materials, their desks, their work area, whatever. The more we can make it visual, labeled, bright, clear, simple. I mean, think about when you're driving down the street, you see a stoplight. It's got a red, green, and yellow. Very clear, very simple. Everybody knows what it needs. It's not small. Those are giant lights. Imagine a stop sign. They're huge. They're a couple feet big. It's huge, huge font, very clear, and one word. How can we make visual the structures that we need our kids to adapt to? So I guess those are two of the big questions that I'd have is how can we make it visual and simple and easy? Yeah. And then how can we get the buy-in and ownership?
Excellent. In structuring time, I've definitely had some questions from students about that, because what's missing right now, absent school, you have all these cues which trigger behaviors, and then it's from your peers, from bells, time, that are gone. And so now
I'm so glad you said cues.
Yeah, these cues, which really, all the clickware responses we have in our brain, like they're not getting those signals. And so now students are having to, for themselves, find ways to manage self-imposed timing structures to regulate time for themselves. And there are kids saying, I'm having a hard time balancing, my activities, my academics. Like, it's harder now than it was before for me. Do you have any insights on that?
I mean, first of all, I think cues is a great word, better than the visual word, because cues can include all kinds. I mean, visual is a cue, and you can think. So I use timers like crazy. I teach my kids how to use timers, digital timers. So those are really helpful because they're auditory, visual, and kinesthetic.
Yep.
The other thing is that. Yeah, for the kids the kids that I work with, they're really resistant to doing a lot of their work. But I think in this time, one thing I guess I would say to kids is that, when you feel blah, I mean, I'm sure, Jed, I'm guessing, have you had some days, especially earlier in March and April and May, where you just had nothing?
There have been some very hard days, very flat days, no question. Yeah.
And I think to imagine for the kids to be, quote, motivated to do the things they're being asked to do, I mean, they're having off days like they normally would, but now they're having more off days. They're not having social connection. So just for them to give themselves a break, that they don't have to get everything done, and they should advocate for themselves And you asked me specifically about kids, so I'm not sure if you want to hear, about parents too, but they need to advocate for themselves and
Yeah.
say, hey, teacher, I can't do it. And not be ashamed, because some teachers, some more traditional, very in the box teachers who don't get these kids, you have to really advocate for them, because they can use shaming messages that are like, well, you need to try harder, or I'm giving you the zero or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's important for the kids to have the confidence to say, look, I can't rally. I'm having a bad day. I'm having a bad week. I'm having a bad month.
Yeah.
I cannot get my brain to do what you're asking me to. I don't know where to start. I can't find the stuff online. It takes me 20 minutes just to understand the thing before I even get started. And by that time, these kids need downtime anyway. They need social time. They need play time. They need imagination time. They need family time. So I think to empower the kids to say, you're not alone,
Yeah.
there's nothing wrong with you. You're not broken. It's not that you're not trying hard enough. What you're being asked to do, you can't rally to do it right now, and it's so okay. Now the problem is that we do have a system that then is judging them by these things, and with grades and things like that. So that's a whole nother issue. But I think, first of all, telling them, yeah, there's nothing wrong with you. What do you need, and how can I help you? How can I be supportive?
So there's a continuum, a spectrum, or the quad matrix of parenting, from permissive to authoritarian, authoritative, all the different pieces. And a kid
Is
comes to
that a
you,
thing? Because I don't
yeah,
know that. I want to look it up.
I can share it with you. Yes,
Thank
there's,
you. The quad matrix of parenting.
yeah,
Boom.
it has to
I
do
love
with,
new models.
I'll share it with you. I was reading about it actually last night. I'm reading Sapolsky's work on behavior. And he was kind of referencing his research in the 60s. Then they added a quadrant from Stanford, but initially it was like authoritarian. And then we went to authoritative, and then we added like negligent, and then permissive. So I'll share you the stuff. It's pretty cool. And a part of it is being supportive, nurturing. I think the way they operationalize it, they call that authoritative. Whereas there's an authority figure, and their expectations, and they're high, but there's support and there's warmth, and things are, it's not walls or rigid boundaries, but it's more flexible. Then authoritarian is less warmth, but very demanding. And then permissive, you kind of get a sense of it, the matrix. Um, but a kid comes to you and he says, okay, you know what, I can't do it. And the question is, when's it okay for a kid who's struggling to say, you don't have to do this today, or you can do this in a different way than assigned? Like, when do you, again, for like, they're having a hard time, when do you say, okay, we can shift, or when do you try to say, you know what, there's a little more here. I feel like you could accomplish this. Like, how do you balance, how do you square that with your kids?
Yeah. Well, one thing that I talk about is what I call iceberg theory. So my blog, you can look up iceberg theory, and that is that what we often see is what's on top of the iceberg, which is that there are zeros or missings or incompletes or late work or excuses or so that's very tangible. But we have to get clear on what's beneath the iceberg. Are there food allergies? I had a student who was 15 she had Crohn's. Nobody knew it.
Yeah.
She was leaving class every day. The teachers were frustrated with her. They thought she was trying to get at, like that for years. And it was very embarrassing for her. And finally, it got like nobody knew that. Well, that was impacting everything underneath the iceberg. So is there ADHD? Is there something that's not diagnosed? Are there sensory issues? There's so many things to look at. So when I'm evaluating, where is that line where I can say, you know what, you need a day to yourself or whatever. It's I think it really has to do with understanding what's beneath the iceberg. I think it has a lot to do with attunement. So I get to know my students very well. And when we spend the time building the relationship, I can tell when I can feel it when
Yeah.
something's off. And I can say, wow, what do you need right now? And when they say what they need, I can say, that sounds good to me. Why don't you do that? And then on the complete other hand, this is going to sound contradictory, but it's not. I'm always pushing them. Now, if they're dysregulated and it's really like I've attuned and that's one thing. That's like we need to address what's going on
Yeah.
emotionally or whatever. But when at any other time, I am always pushing them. So I talk about this gray space that we play in. And on one side of the space, and this is very much what when you said permissive
Yeah.
and authoritarian, or you could look at the gray space as sort of the secure space if we're looking at attachment theory.
Yeah.
But this gray space is warm and nurturing and encouraging, what have you. So here on this side, we have one line, and on this side we have another line. So this is the comfort zone. So here they're in the comfort zone. Pushing them here, I'm always pushing them beyond their comfort zone. Always. I don't care if it's content. I don't care if it's executive function. Whatever it is, I'm always pushing them past their comfort zone. But here is the threshold. Here's sort of might be the authoritative. Like if I push them past the threshold, I lose them.
Yep.
If I don't push them past the comfort zone, they don't grow, and they're in learned helplessness land. They're in permissive land, right? So I'm always playing in this zone. So as a coach, my dance, my game is in this area. That's where I can get them to grow. But if I push them too far, they're not going to want to work with Seth. They're not going to feel secure around Seth. They're not going to trust Seth. They're not going to let me push them. So my job is to make them walk out of my office or a session with me or whatever, feeling good about who they are, and not pushing them past that, and not allowing them where they're not growing. Now, for a parent, that zone might be like this or this. Like, so I'm telling you, parents, yes, it's easier for me. Yes, it's easier for certain people to work in that zone with your kid. Yes, you have a bigger challenge. But either way, the dance that you want to play, in my opinion, is in that zone. You want to really contemplate and work through and figure out for yourself, where am I doing too much for them? That's back here. And then where am I not putting enough structure, and how do I play in that zone? Because parents often lose them. They come with the lectures and the nagging and the punishment and the reward and all this stuff, and you lose them. They might do the thing, but they're doing it because they're being compliant, because they want you to stop bugging them, or whatever the thing is, not because there's an internal locus of control where they're developing skills of autonomy.
I think about that a lot. Like things aren't binary or dichotomous. It's like there's a continuum and there's a sweet spot. I think about like the stress performance curve, like, the eustress, then distress, and keeping them right in that sweet spot where they're cooking, there's at the right level of stress, and they're learning and they're pushing. In terms of that, in terms of like, with the dilemma of helping and assisting, and the balance point of how much help is too much help, and the right balance before you take over, because that's, you can push them so far that it becomes really problematic, but also you could take over so much, swoop in, that then you deprive them of this gift, this challenge. How do you think about that? And for parents also, the right balance of the right amount of help, but not too much and not too little.
I think that's a really tough one, and that's where a good coach comes in, because that's going to be so different for so many. Now, I am going to give you a real answer to that question, because I know that kind of an answer doesn't help anybody. But I think that what happens when you work with a coach or a therapist or a counselor or a brilliant teacher, or just somebody who kind of sees the matrix of what you're going through, what they give you is they give you clarity. And when you get clarity, you're able to make better decisions. So in order to make better decisions I think what you're asking is, how do you know when you're helping too much and not enough and just right? Right.
Yeah, for a parent who's wondering, my kid's struggling some,
Right.
what's the right role, the right level of involvement? When should I back off? When should I jump in? And it's that whole conversation.
And I think it's so different. We all have dysfunction, all of us, some more, some less. And there's no shame around that. So I think for families to be able to say, you know what, we got stuff, we got programming, I got unconscious stuff I do. I'm not even aware when I do X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to work on myself, and I'm going to learn about this, and I'm going to read about it. And then you can start to find your boundaries. But without self-awareness around it, and with keeping our head in the sand and not wanting to address, and a lot of people are, now I'm at a place in my life where I love diving into my issues, for lack of a better word, but I just don't have the tolerance for when I notice something about myself. But a lot of us, it's really hard to get, it's scary. And I want to honor that in people, where looking inward at these things that have impacted us, it can be very scary, very. But the more we become self-aware and address that stuff, the more we'll be attuned to, yeah, I'm rescuing and enabling and doing too much for my child right now, and I'm going to make a different decision, or I'm not supporting my child enough right now, and I'm going to make a different decision,
Thank you.
or I'm being too rigid, or whatever the thing is.
Yeah, that's good. I have a question about,
So can I wrap that up? So
oh,
the
please.
question is how to get the self-awareness, and that
Yeah,
can be a coach, that can be a book, that can be any number of ways. But I think the answer is, the more aware we are of the unconscious stuff, the more we're going to be able to be very honest with ourselves about which line we're crossing and where we want to be.
excellent. And I'm in the world I play in with a lot of college admissions work. I'm really averse of the swooping and saving, especially when we're about to send kids off to college, when the parents aren't there. And in terms of, if you prevent a failure now, you're going to create a larger failure with more consequences later. So it's like letting some of the stumbling, some of the scraped knees happen now versus, having big failures later.
I can't tell you how many second year college students I have. They're not always called sophomores, but people come, when they have a college student and they want me to coach their kid, they come to me because their kid just failed their freshman year,
Yeah.
or just about failed it. Maybe they made it to sophomore year, but it was, so yeah, that it's really important that, and then parents, and then I was just having a discussion with my families in my group the other day about this. Parents don't want their kids to fall so hard that it has tremendous consequences.
Yep.
So how do you know when it's like a safe
Right.
failure and when it's an unsafe failure? And that's different from situation to situation. But again, the more self-awareness we have, the more we can be sure that we're not, because rescuing them and enabling them is not helping. That's not what help is.
We're trying to build, competent adults who can handle things and challenges and stressors and not crumble and have resilience and all the good stuff. Um, so I want to make sure we do hit some of the points of actually working in like a online hybrid environment. Some kids are working in the space, and I gave a talk last week, and I had several kids writing in with questions about distractions, and general thoughts on being a student at home, working. How do I optimize my learning environment? How do I manage this? I have a brother who's a teacher in Toronto, and he says he knows half of his kids have their cell phones down, below the screen, or they're it's like they're not getting nearly as much as other kids are. And when they're doing most of their work with a screen, and then right next door you have all these web browsers, and you have all these pathways toward distraction that are greater than in a classroom. You have to work harder, in a classroom, but and some of the kids are saying, I'm having a hard time with this. I'm becoming less efficient. I'm losing time. I'm going down rabbit holes. Any thoughts or ideas? This is clear, an EF kind of move here. So how do I balance? How do I inhibit? How do I structure my thoughts, my workspace to minimize distractions when I'm in a remote learning environment?
Well, first of all, kudos to the students who ask for help, because I get students who are very resistant, and a lot of what I do is help them work with their own resistance.
Okay.
So for the students who are asking, how do I do this? That is where we want them. That is an amazing, amazing, amazing place to be if a student autonomously is asking, how do I do this? One of the hardest things for all humans to learn is how to ask for help. And if
Yeah.
somebody's asking for help, that's amazing right there. And that gives me a lot of hope for those kids right there, that they know how to ask for help and they're self-aware enough to know that it's a problem. That's amazing. So yeah, there's a book by Cal Newport called Digital Minimalism, which is a fantastic book. There are a lot of experts. This is not my area of expertise, but what I talk about is what's called a sacred study space. So right now I'm working with you. I have my mic, my computer, and I'm at a standing desk. I'm standing right now. I love standing desks. I focus more. I used to listen to music. I now hardly ever listen to music when I'm doing deep work. So You have to be the thing is, I talk about what I call Frankenstudy, but the idea of Frankenstudy is differentiation for those of you teachers watching. But the idea of differentiation for those of you who are not teachers watching is customizing, tailoring, personalizing a study space. So mine and Jed's may be very different. Jed may love whiteboards and cork boards and this and that. I may love sticky notes and note cards and audible reminders of things, whatever. So, but the idea is, how do we really, because it's not just go sit at your desk, kid. It's how do we help you design a personalized space for you where you do two things. How do you optimize it for focus and minimize it for distraction? How do you optimize it for focus, minimize it for distraction? You can do your own assessment, make a chart, and just write down optimize for focus, minimize for distraction. So for me, for example, I turn my phone and device completely off at night. I don't sleep with a phone or a computer in the bedroom. It's just too tempting for me. So, and for me, just getting up for a couple minutes to check something, first of all, it doesn't end up being a couple minutes. Second of all, it ruins me the next day. Now, college kids bounce back a lot quicker, but either way, it's how can they be realistic about what their boundaries are? Can I coach them to turn their device off completely when they're working? But I think one of the hardest things that we're doing right now is we're saying to kids, use this device that is filled with things that are way, way, way more engaging than what we are asking you to do, and avoid those things that are a click away and focus on this less engaging thing. And it's really not it's just not a good situation. So, but for the kids who want to do it, I think really customize a space for yourself. Spend time doing it. Spend money doing it. And it doesn't have to be a lot, but like go buy things that will help you. You know, if you need noise canceling headphones and it's in your means to get those, get them. If you want a device that does white noise, if you want to turn on a fan in the background, if you like silence, if you like classical music, whatever the thing is, if you like a dark room, a bright room, I have a purple light behind me. Like, make your environment customized to you. If you like visual distractions and reminders and famous quotes on the wall, like I like stuff like that, then put it on the wall. If you like a blank wall, but I think the big thing is to be realistic with yourself. You got a lot of people who say, oh yeah, listening to such and such music helps me. Well, there's research about that you all can look up all kinds of research about this, but what research shows is that if you are doing deep work where you really have to focus, that music with lyrics and louder music is more distracting. If you're doing busy work, then that can actually help you. But it's different for that. I don't like, but even though it's research based, there's still, as you said, there's the whole spectrum of how people, you have to be honest with yourself about how things are impacting you so that you can create that space and optimize your workflow. And that, I'm telling you, for me and Jed both, like this is a multi-year process,
Yep.
but you do need to spend time designing it, not just sit down at a desk.
So sometimes you can manage and regulate and engineer the environment. So it's, you minimize distractions, optimize focus. But in some cases, like you're on a computer, you're working the web, and you have to use these tools, but right next to them are the very compelling dopamine hitting tools, right one click away. Do you talk about having contracts with yourself, or having rules, or having like internal boundaries when you can't engineer them away structurally? But because willpower, we know, falls apart constantly.
That's the problem. Like with people with strong executive function, they have plenty of willpower and they can override that stuff and self-regulate way better. For people like me who, I stopped playing video games in 2003 because I was playing the stupidest game in the world for 3 hours a day. And I was like, what the hell am I doing? Like, this is, I do not want to invest any more time in my life in this stupid thing. Like, my brain just loves it. So I don't, I think if you are maturing and becoming a mature college student, there comes a time when you really, so what happens is we don't have great future thinking, But there comes a time when you say, you know what, I'm investing in my future. I'm going to delete this from my computer and never use it again, or put on this device and never that device, or use an internet blocker. There's many types of blockers. You can just look up internet blocker and block my thing. But the problem is these kids know how to get around the blockers too. So,
Right.
but you have to have, what I don't want you to do, what Jed's talking about, is to think that in the moment you need to have self-control and willpower. That's not likely to happen. It's out of the moment when you're having some sanity and you're like, look, I want to make an awesome life for myself. I want to have options and future and possibilities and a great life. I don't want mediocrity. I certainly don't want a bad life where I'm struggling. I want a really good life. And I'm going to invest in myself by setting this boundary with myself. And so there's one last saying that I'll end up with here, Jed, and it is make what's easy hard and make what's hard easy. So if it's easy to get to the things that are distracting, make it as hard as possible to ever get to those. And if it's hard to get to your links that you need and to get to your teacher and to go to office hours and to advocate for yourself and to hire to make those things as easy as possible.
I heard one of your video logs about having the links right up there, dropping them in, so they're the first thing you see on your Google, like your bar, teachers, this portal, that portal. So again, it's effortless to find them.
Right. So that makes,
with the passwords embedded, things like that.
right. So that's what makes what's hard easy. So these kids can find their gaming or whatever like that.
Yeah.
Well, you want it to be that easy to find the things that really matter. So yeah, I won't go over that whole tip, but yeah, so you can have your browser open the tabs that you need. So maybe it opens your calendar, your email, your portals and everything, and it's easier to close those rather than have to go in and open every single one individually. If you know you don't need it that day, it's just easier to close them when you don't need them, and everything's there.
Perfect. Maybe with time for probably a couple more of my questions, then I'll go to the audience questions. We have already a couple lining up. So I want to ask you about routine, schedule, time, and are there any must-haves or guidelines you want people to know about creating a routine or a schedule, and then eventually how to help students follow them as parents or as educators?
I'll give you one tip
Yeah.
here.
One tip.
So the thing is when it comes to for students who are working on things, when people have very good executive function, again, this is going to be really different depending on the brain. But for people who have strong executive function, they'll say things like, why don't you do 10 minutes a day of this classwork? And that's because their brain works where they can do a little bit each day.
Yeah.
For kids who struggle with executive function, for a lot of my college kids, what I really recommend is because these kids don't have structure or schedule. They have the times of the classes, but everything else is completely loosey-goosey.
Yeah.
And if you're not a structured person, if you're not a linear brain person, then creating that structure is really hard. So what you want to do is set yourself up for success by having very large blocks of time to work on school. And what that means in my world is 3 to 5 hour blocks. So let's say you have 2 classes on Tuesday and Thursday. And let's say that in between those 2 classes, you have a 3-hour block. Well, go to the library, wherever you're studying. Now, this is pre-COVID, but generally speaking, like go to your favorite coffee shop or wherever you can focus for those 3 hours. You can take your time. Maybe in that 3 hours, you're only going to get an hour's worth of work done. But that's very different from saying, here's the 30-minute block. I want you to focus 100% for 30 minutes. That doesn't work for these kids. Right. It takes my kids 20 minutes or so just to even figure out what the heck they're doing. And it takes them 30 minutes, another 10 just to sort of get the ball rolling. And then, are you going to take a break at that point? Well, yeah, a lot of my students want to, but that is not the time to take a break. Like, I want their brain to be like, okay, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I'm going to have this 3-hour block. And on Mondays, I'm going to have a study partner. So there's accountability. And I'm going to have a 5-hour block from 5 to 10 p.m. We're going to order pizza, hang out, whatever. And so you have to be very realistic and sort of over plan and give yourself lots of spaciousness to do this stuff. So part of when I'm helping college kids block out schedules, we're getting very large blocks to immerse. I don't want them rushing through it. I want them to immerse themselves in the work. But we got to understand it takes a while to get the train going. And then it takes a while even to wrap it up and clean up and get stuff reorganized.
Excellent. All right, my last question, then we'll go to the questions that are starting to pile up over here. In terms of hybrid environments and the kids having to pivot, I think of like shift workers, your work changes. So I'm in school on these 2 days, I'm at home on these days. And some kids don't switch gears as easily or have trouble with that kind of transition. Any ideas on supporting students who are going through right now a hybrid kind of schedule?
Change the system. I mean, that's kind of like what I was just saying. Like, what we have is a system. Let's not look at college in this example. Let's look at middle or high school where they go to 6 or 7 or 8 classes or periods a day. And they're expected to transition every 45 or 55
Yeah.
minutes.
Bing, bing.
Like, it's hard for anybody, but kids who struggle with executive function, it's particularly hard. How are they
Yeah.
going to remember the right materials, get to their locker? Like, their brains don't work like that. But it's also like that's not how like the brain works too. To like have history for 45 minutes, then this for 40. You and I have blocked out time today, right? But when you and I are doing our own personal growth, like if I'm working on my website or my YouTube channel or something like that, I'm not going to sit there and say, oh, I'm going to give myself 30 minutes for YouTube, 30 minutes for my website. And you're not going to either. We want to immerse. And that's why that Cal Newport book is so good. So I guess I think to give you a real answer, so
Yeah.
there's my rant, change the system so that we're getting more immersive experiences that are way deeper and more interesting and longer and stuff. But the more practical answer would be these kids are not systems thinkers. They have to really think. So I'm very minimalist
Yeah.
in the way that I help kids. I want them to have, when I have a kid who has 100 pencils in his backpack, very rarely will I let him keep that. If they really lose them all the time, that's good for that kid. But for the kid who doesn't lose them all the time, like I want it stripped down to what is the bare necessities. And I want those systems color coded, visual, easy to find. I want them to have homes for things. I want to think it through with them before they're in the situation.
Yeah.
And I do a lot of dialogue. So I say, so where's the best place for your pens and pencils? Why? Are you sure? Cool. Let's move on. How are you going to organize this? Why? Blah, blah, blah. I really guide them a lot. I want, again, most of the ideas to come from them.
Yeah.
But so so I guess to help them transition, they need to understand their systems. They need the alerts. They need the color coding. And they also need teachers that are patient.
Yeah.
And
And the idea of putting that in terms of the critical thinking and evaluation on the kids and the whole, really, this is the way it's always been. This is the way we've always done it versus really getting down to why. And why do you need 100 pencils in your bag? I actually probably don't. And you're carting around extra dead weight and making it harder to find things and X, Y, Z.
mm-hmm.
All right, well, let me jump to the audience questions. And everyone, if you want.
I want to interrupt you and
please.
tell you, Jed, that you're awesome.
Oh,
Thank you for serving humanity and people and doing good things in the world and giving of yourself so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. That's really cool. You too, and your work and your generosity, and I love how much you give away as well. It's incredible. All right, so we have questions from the audience that are coming in. The first one is, do you have any recommendations for resources for how to work on emotional regulation? That's a big one.
I just talked with my group about that last night, and that is a big one. And I don't even know where to start to answer that question. Okay, here's where I'm going to start. As far as resources, you find them, but I'll give you sort of direction to go in. Even though it may not seem like emotional regulation, look up attachment theory, look up polyvagal theory, look up models of therapy or counseling models or things like that. Just look up Google images for models and start going down those rabbit holes. But those are some of my favorites. And then look up mindfulness and mindfulness meditation. So those are some of my biggest. The other thing is that when you are looking for resources for that, I want to break it into those two. For emotional regulation, I want to break it into those two pieces for you. One, you have the narrative and the story, the mind, the chatter. So you have things called talk therapies that often deal with the reframing, if you're familiar with Carol Dweck, or mindsets, attitudes, perspectives. So we have these narratives and stories. We're working with that. When we're helping people emotionally regulate, we have to work with the narrative and the story. Two, we have to work with the somatic body, the nervous system. We are having physical reactions. Here in the United States, we do not value people's physical reactions. We don't talk about them. We're not aware of, particularly men, we're not aware of what's even going on in our bodies or how that's connected to anything, in any of our thoughts. So we have the story, but we have physical responses. And to teach a kid or an adult to learn to regulate emotion, they have to be aware of those two things and how they're responding so that they can make different choices. Now, within the nervous system, the body, I love, you can look up somatic experiencing, brain spotting, EMDR. You don't have to do these things, but just start understanding that there are all these people who have spent decades of their lives working on how to help human beings not be ruled by their emotions and their nervous systems. Look at what they have to offer us, research those sorts of concepts, and see that, wow, brain spotting, EMDR, somatic experiencing, all of these things are similar. Art therapy, play therapy, they're all doing the same kinds of things. They're helping the nervous system move emotion through and helping sort of, I don't like the word rewire, but for lack of a better word, rewire the narratives and the stories in the brain so that we can access better solutions in the moment and proactively.
Fabulous. I'll throw in a plug for Marshall Linehan's work with, dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT stuff. It's all about distress tolerance, learning how to handle some distress. And one of my favorite books, an author, his name is John Lee. He put out a book called Growing Yourself Back Up. When you are regressed, and regression loves company, like learning how to balance and so you don't say things you're going to regret later on. So John Lee's work is pretty good. So it's Growing Yourself Back Up. It's pretty good.
You're really good at citing
Well,
the
I just know, I remember,
resources.
I spent 10
Yeah,
years going to men's retreats with John. I think he's great. All right, so we have more questions coming in. How do you recommend getting a high schooler out of bed and dressed for virtual classes? Or should I just give up and not make a big deal about doing school in bed or in underwear?
I mean,
Okay.
this is, well, it depends. I mean, that's, if they're on video, that's just inappropriate. and, and that crosses boundaries and lines that should not be crossed. That can get them into multiple forms of trouble. So that, when we talk about how to let your kid fail, that's probably not an area.
Right.
But in terms of how to deal with that situation, I think it goes back to what I was talking about before, is the the buy-in and the ownership.
Yeah.
So the way the question is framed, thank you for asking that question, how do we get them to, is how does this external force change or get this person to do this thing? Well, you want to reframe that whole thing. And that's probably how you were raised, and the subcultures you grew up in and stuff. That's sort of more, we get people to do things. But this kid, you're not going to get him to do anything. You're going to want him to take some buy-in and ownership, and it's not going to be overnight. And that's what's really hard, because I would be coaching you to really get to know the story, but you want the kid to feel buy-in and ownership, that he or she is making the choices, and these are the consequences, natural consequences, and work on the relationship. And you're in a tough situation, and this is one of those kids who, when I work with kids like this, I'm not going to lie to you, it's a long path turning it around. It's doable
Yeah.
completely, but the more you work on your own attachment stuff and letting go and not enabling and stuff like that, and the more buy-in and ownership, the sooner you're going to get there.
And for me also, part of it would depend upon the level of efficacy of the student. So part of it, can you perform at level in bed? And it's like for us, people who wanted to work remotely, like part of it is some people are amazing at it, some people weren't before the COVID. And part of it is if you can get your work done at home and hit your targets and metrics, that's great. But if you're having a hard time with it, not great. So can you work in bed and get your work done and do it well? Brilliant. But if you're really struggling, failing, then maybe you need the cue of dressing up, of putting on, sitting at a desk, and it may depend, I think part of it too. And versus judging it and saying this is lazy, or shaming it or naming it, versus, you know what, you're actually knocking everything out and you're getting high marks. Okay, at some level, if it's working for them.
And for my kids, I tell them the worst place to study ever is in bed, because for my kids, they're not getting, they're taking something that could take 30 minutes and making it take 4 hours. So
Got it. So for those kids, get out of bed, find a desk, dress up, do it right. And but for other kids, I did very well as a kid academically. I did most of my studying in bed, and but again, depends on what you're bringing, and so forth. Mark, there was a comment earlier about having boundaries, having two boundaries for students. Okay, the first one you want to move past their comfort zone, but you don't want to push past the second boundary. Something.
I
What
call it the
was
threshold.
the
And I
threshold?
mean, this is just something that I talk about, but I call it the comfort zone and the threshold. So we
Okay.
want to push them a little bit past their comfort zone, but we don't want to push them past their threshold because we lose them. And again, parents, you're playing in this zone where sometimes you can just say one thing, they're like, "Leave me alone," blah, 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 you know. But that's where the magic happens is in that zone.
Excellent. Versus like distress or breakdown or whatever that line you're crossing, where they can't regulate beyond that point. Too much.
Mhm.
Very good. All right, a student here. All right, I'm having trouble finding interest in the subjects I like. Example, I love economics and calculus, but I'm just barely scraping by right now. What can I do to motivate myself? Okay, so you love economics, you love calculus, but you're barely scraping by. What can I do to motivate my own self? Interesting.
So I have a very different take on motivation. There's a lot of really cool research on motivation.
Yeah.
But my first gut feeling is this is going to be controversial, but is that there's no hurry to get anywhere. This is a tough time. Like you can you can take fewer classes each semester. There's no race to graduate. There's no getting anywhere. This is like I failed out of college. I dropped out of a second college before failing out. When I finally went back to college and had purpose and meaning and I wanted to be there, I took it very slow and took like 5 years because I wanted to enjoy learning and enjoy my classes and really I didn't want to rush to graduate. But I was very clear on, life is very short. Every moment is very precious. And, you're in a bizarre time in human history. When you look back on this in 10 or 20 or 30 years, you're going to be like, whoa, oh my gosh, when we were in it, it was like, that's the experience we were having. But looking back, like, so give yourself a break, listen to yourself. If you're not really motivated, take what's motivating. It's okay to change course. It's okay to recalibrate when you're ready. This is not conventional wisdom, what I'm saying right now. But you have to do like life is, you got 100 years here. You know, me and Jed, we got 20 left. I'm just kidding. Hopefully we have a very,
Or I hope.
hopefully we have a very long time ahead. But you got, you got a blip, 100 years, but it's a blip. It's like life is so short and precious. So I'm big on that. Like, really, if you're not motivated, maybe you need a lot of self-care right now and a lot of meditation or relaxation or art or this or that. And maybe you're taking too many. I don't know the answer, but the other thing is if you are consciously saying, well, Seth, I hear you, but I do want to get through certain classes and check these things off my list and reach certain goals at certain times. That's a different story too, and that's totally fine. And in that case, I would suggest something different to you. In that case, I would suggest really immersing yourself in amazing documentaries on YouTube or podcasts that are about the classes that you're in already. So you're kind of killing two birds on one stone with one stone and making what's hard easier. I would make what's hard easier by having a study group or two or three, either online or whatever is safe for you. But having a committed group of totally nerdy people. And when I say nerdy, I say that in the best possible way, in the interests that you have and the classes that you have. They don't even have to be in your classes, but just some awesome people who, like, you guys know you're going to have fun, eat some food, meet online, whatever, at certain committed times. That takes the choice out of it. And I'm sure Jed sees this a lot too, but for implementing structure when it's hard to, the more you take the choice out of it, the easier it is to do it. When we have all this freedom and choice, that there's something called the paradox of choice. That's not necessarily a good thing. So those are some of my gut reactions and be easy on yourself. Like it's so okay.
Excellent. There's a question, I think, with a pretty easy answer from Kirsten. Can exercise help with emotional regulation? And then how do we help kids when they're in a low? So the short answer is, Seth, can exercise help?
Absolutely. So at the beginning of COVID, like I could tell, I mean, I meditate a lot. I'm very attuned with my nervous system. I could tell that the lack, and I'm an extrovert. So for me, the lack of social, and I know introverts who are loving it, but for me, the lack of social was like physically painful. And I hike almost every day. I live in Colorado, and but I upped it like crazy because the days that I wouldn't hike. I would just lay in bed at night. My mood would just go to pieces. So, but yes, it absolutely does. There's plenty of research on it. Um, the problem is I do get students who are very sedentary, very much into electronics and not moving and not having the future thought that I mentioned before and not seeing that, oh, I'm going to have consequences like years of back pain or blah, 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 which are very real consequences that, sedentary people kids will have when they're older. So getting them to do it again, you need buy-in and ownership, but you also need something I haven't mentioned today, and that is chunking. So we need to make things successible. I don't know if that's a word, but we need to give the kid an opportunity to succeed. So if we want them to do exercise and they're not going to go to the gym for an hour or they're not going to join a team or whatever, how do we get them to walk halfway down the block? If that's a success for that kid, that's where you're starting. That's also called scaffolding. It's also called gradual release of responsibility. But we have to give them an opportunity to succeed. And then you have to do it over and over and over until that resistance starts to fade away. And eventually, so these can be long journeys for those super resistant kids with that. But yeah, it absolutely is so important. It helps the brain. Absolutely. We are moving creatures.
Definitely. All right, we have time for two more, and these are actually my questions, and then we'll wrap this up. In terms of silver linings, so we're going through this moment. It's to your point, it's a point of inflection for society, for us individually. We'll look back. Our parents talked about when Kennedy was shot. They had moments that changed them. And going through this is a moment where we'll look back and kind of mark where we were pre and post this experience. And so, from your perception of where things are, what's happening with these kids right now, are there any silver linings or opportunities in this moment? So when we get past this, things that pivoted, changed, shifted for the positive.
Absolutely, positively. I mean, humans have gone through very difficult things many times. The thing that, and I'm going to start with something not silver lining, sorry.
Yeah.
The thing that really concerns me is the lack of awareness of that we still have the potential for the environment is collapsing. Like I want our kids and our grandkids and their kids to have a world that can sustain human life. A couple hundred years ago, we had 2 billion people. Now we have 7.8 billion people. It's astounding. Our impact is tremendous, and people just seem to not notice. And I don't get it. So my first thing would say, everybody watching, please do your research, figure out your footprint and what you can do because it matters. So there's my not silver lining. We need to have a world to have a silver lining in.
Yeah.
But the silver lining, oh my gosh, there is so much hope. This life that's a blip, it is precious. It's all about relationships. It's all about connection. It's all about things that matter, that give you purpose and meaning and joy. It's all about finding what matters to you. I get to do work I love. Jed gets to do work Jed loves. We get to really make choices but what it all comes down to is relationships. I love doing what I do because of the people that I work with. Jed loves doing, I'm sure, I'm putting words in Jed's mouth, but what he does because of the relationships, because he gets to have an impact that matters to him. And then at the end of the day, when I'm not working with other people, it's about my family and my friends, and it's about relationships. So there's so much silver lining. You will figure it out. We are supposed to make mistakes. The traditional paths that we have, there's so many ways to find your way. The life is full of opportunities, and we can get what's called myopic. We can get blinders on, and we can get stuck in this, but we can also change that. We can have mental health issues and depression and anxiety and relationship problems and and health issues, real difficult stuff. We can get through it. The mind is a practice. When I was a young man, I struggled with a lot of depression. After I got out of that, and did my work around that, I realized that I had worked very hard to be depressed. I practiced my negativity very hard. I worked on it day in and day out. I didn't think of it. I felt like a victim at the time. But what I learned was that now I have an internal locus of control. Now I have agency. What was the word that you used similar to agency just a moment ago? Efficacy.
Efficacy, yeah. Yeah. Self-efficacy, yeah, for sure.
Self-efficacy. So I have, my life is mine now. I'm 100% responsible, and it's not perfect, but I have a good life. But there's so much hope. I have seen kids that are coming from addiction, from some of the most tremendous problems you can ever imagine, and I've seen them turn it around. I've turned it around myself. I've seen many, 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 many people turn it around and get on a path where they're like, my life isn't perfect, but it's pretty good. And so that's my response to that. Yeah, so much silver lining, always hope. The only thing, the worst thing you can do is nothing.
Yeah.
Do something.
Yeah.
And the universe will put steps in your way to help you, help support you.
All right. Our final question is, after everything we talked about, all the different pieces, approaches, strategies, how do parents decide where to start? And is there one thing you recommend the parents should do first or prioritize first if they're trying to help their kids in this time?
I get that question a lot, and it depends. If we're talking, I usually get it in the context of like with the executive function things, and it's like it doesn't really matter. Just start. People want a recipe and a blueprint and a roadmap, and while I have models that do that, the reality is it's a spiral, and we come back to things over and over and over until there's some sense of mastery. So start anywhere. Being here right now is starting. And that was a two-part question. What was the other part?
It was in terms of helping parents, and is there one thing you prioritize to help parents help their kids?
Yeah,
Right?
the relationship and the nervous system and that sort of thing. So your own self-care, your own deep inner work, your own self-work is where I would say you should start. So you're trying to help your child. How do you help your child? You start with you and your own self-honesty and your own asking for help and all of those things. And then you start with the relationship. Like after you get off of this webinar today, like close your eyes for a few minutes and think, what am I going to do with my kid today that's fun? How are we going to laugh together? How am I going to look them in the eye? If you live with them and they're not in college, how am I going to give them a hug today? How am I going to connect with them today? Like that's the most, so that's where you start, like today. You don't start like get off this call and start looking at your notes. I want you to think about how can I connect in a meaningful way, regardless of whatever your circumstances are, how can I connect with my child today in a meaningful way? And then, and then just work on your self-care, your own deep inner work and stuff like that. That's, I think, where you start.
That's brilliant. I love it. We're getting some love from the audience saying thank you and how inspiring and motivating and positive we've been. So I think we're going to call it an hour. Seth, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Jed. Appreciate it.
And I really enjoyed it. And everybody, we're going to send you a copy. We'll have a copy of the video. We're happy to share if you want to share with a friend, and it'll be posted also on Seth's website. Seth, what is your site? Give to the people.
My website is sethperler.com, SETHPERLER, and I have all kinds of great freebies and stuff. I have a lot of stuff. I have a YouTube channel. I don't know what it's called, but look up my name on YouTube. And then I also have TFOS, ExecutiveFunctionSummit.com.
It's excellent, and I was there watching and learning a bunch myself.
It's good.
So great stuff. All right. Well, everyone, thanks for being here, being part of this. And Seth, thank you again so much.
Thanks, everybody.